Chris, I know there were a lot of comments. We had a bunch of questions we didn't get to. So when you drop off, you're still welcome to go through and provide question or answers. So I'm not the only one doing all the typing on
Got it.
that. And I think, is Frank on? We'll assume he'll be coming on shortly. So Chris and Jim, if you could drop off video. There we go. Up there's Frank with Title Cyber.
Officially
So
became panelist, so thank you.
there you go. Frank, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
So I'm gonna just pull you in quickly to a conversation you and I had 2 months ago about breach and attack simulation.
Oh dear.
Yeah, I know you didn't expect to get ambushed, but we got to speak the truth. So for those of you who don't know, Frank, long time with MITRE and left with a few folks to create a really interesting product on, I think, helping make MITRE attack more real to the world as opposed to the bingo card that I get credit for that quote from like 6, 7 years ago. But point being is I find Frank to be a kindred spirit and Tidal Cyber to be a kindred product and company trying to tackle these challenges. And one of those that has come along the way is Frank has had the opportunity to see some of the challenges and limitations in breach and attack simulation. So, as part of your introduction, I just like to throw that to you, tying back to our keynote rant.
Let me throw some shade at some other friends. No, I think so my whole philosophy around testing is it's good to have a variety of testing. Just as you layer your defenses, it's really important to layer your testing. So breach and attack simulation can be great, but you have to know the limitations that exist within it, right? And they're going to be executed in a specific way. They're going to have their specific triggers. I know that someone mentioned earlier the fact that they were building. I think it was John might have been mentioning that he saw people were creating rules specifically to address atomic red team techniques. I know atomic red team not really a bad solution, but like if that's the case, that's bad, right? It's missing the whole point, right? It's not about detecting the testers; it's about detecting the behaviors. So I think that BAS testing can be valuable, but you have to understand that it's going to come with its limitations and how it's used. We've always been a big supportive of being able to understand what is the value of each of the levels of testing. So like atomic tests, great, helps validate at a simple level, single detections working. Bad solutions, okay, it's good. You can get some low hanging fruit and continually test and validate, but nothing's going to top the red teams and the adversary emulation and being able to do that human in the loop testing that's actually going to be really threat informed, focusing down, and being able to provide you, frankly, a lot more feedback to your blue teamers than you're ever going to get from some of these automated solutions. So it's a much more tailored look. I think that it's not a one size fits all. I don't think that you necessarily need to employ them all, but I do think understanding the value and the limitations of what you're getting and how that applies to your goals as an organization is what's really important. Does that kind of work?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Liz, you got anything before we throw over?
No, I mean it's just absolutely getting that multi-layered look at everything is key.
Yeah. All right. So with that, should I just roll right in, Bryson?
Take it away, sir.
All right, sounds great. So on that front, with an introduction, Bryce gave me a little bit of one. I had spent 18 years at MITRE, so guilty of a lot of the goods and the bads that came from attack through the years, and I've ridden that roller coaster through it. The talk today is actually around coverage, which I kind of love talking about because, right, as somebody that was doing detection engineering before attack existed, and then Blake was the genius that kind of figured out how to structure what we were developing from a blue team perspective and testing from a red team perspective, right? Attack emerges. Stoplight charts quickly came into vogue as a way of us being able to communicate and was like the chief use case. By the time that I left MITRE, I absolutely hated everything to do with coverage maps for a lot of the reasons why a lot of the audience picks on it today. And then what do? I go off and start a company that focuses around coverage. But it's to Bryce's point about trying to figure out how do we make it better? How do we make it more practical? How do we make attack something that organizations can actually achieve. So through my time at MITRE, I went from detection engineering to attack evangelist to leading attack evaluations. And so we've seen some of the good and the bad about it. And so I thought would be helpful is to kind of look at it from like when we're doing purple teaming, how do we present results? At the end of the day, a lot of our customers want to be able to see what attack coverage is. That's not to say that we don't do it, right? It works. It allows us to quickly visualize results. However, right there, as Chris and co have gone into today, there's so many different caveats that exist to it, the fine print that exists with every coverage map that we have to be aware of. And so it's trying to understand, how do we provide the abstraction, the benefits of attack, but how do we also try to recognize that there are the limitations, that when we do the testing, that's only a certain subset of the procedures, for instance. When we've got that green cell or whatever color cell it is, that there's actual depth to defenses that has to exist beyond it, and not all depth is there. So that's kind of where this talk is going to. To start it off, I think that going to coverage assessments in general, we have the one thing that's been really interesting to realize as I've entered into corporate world versus MITRE ivory tower world has been organizations really do want at the end of the day to be able to treat it as a checkbox, to be able to treat it as that bingo card to a certain degree. They need to be able to check it off and say, yes, we are good. We have satisfied or we've minimized our risk. We've hit all of our controls, our compliance regulations. That's what they want, which is why when you look so many years ago, and this is Bryson's a picture from an early attack con, right? So you got Blake there in front of one of the early stoplight charts. People want that, right? Because they're thinking in terms of checklists. They're thinking about in terms of being able, what's that quick visualization to say, I have done this, I haven't done this. So that's what they want, right? And so we need to figure out how to bridge this gap between the ideal, let's check the boxes, but then actually be able to give it with a certain amount of detail around it. So, well, what is attack coverage in practice? So I threw up a few of these things to talk about the general sentiment around attack coverage. And again, this hits home personally because a lot of this is centered around attack evals. Fun fact, to go into the history machine, right? When we launched attack evals, it was specifically to address vendor misuse of attack coverage. Vendors had been claiming all green charts. They had been saying we've got the 100% coverage. And so a number of vendors, as well as analyst community, as well as end user organizations, all reached out to me and Blake and the team to say, hey, what can MITRE do to help fix this situation? And so what we did is we launched attack evaluations to provide data around it. Of course, as through the first couple of years, there was a little bit of semblance in the we win type of stuff. Some people started counting the number of detections and trying to declare winners, as marketing will do. By the end of it, what we ended up with is the same problem. Everybody was claiming these all green charts, as Chris wonderfully points out here, as his goal for his next company. So it's been the problem, right? Attack coverage is great in concept. It's this easy to see visualization that can really help end user organizations prioritize. In practical nature, there's so many ways of doing it wrong. And if you do it wrong, you get into these problems of all green, 100% coverage. You have the alleys of the world having to write entire reports on why 100% coverage isn't really what you think it is, especially in marketing. That's a problem, right? That's trying to use it as a blunt instrument rather than trying to recognize that there's a lot of intricacy within it. So why is that? Why is it a problem? Why is green not green? Why is 100% not 100%? And this goes to, again, what Chris was talking to. There's so many procedures. In this one, I flattened out the data a little bit because there's a gigantic spike around procedures. Certain techniques have a significant number of procedures. This is specifically around attack. So one of the things that people like to say is attack doesn't have procedures. It really does. They just don't have it structured in the same way. They have what they call relationships. So on every group object, when it says that they use this technique, there's a little description next to it. So what we've done here is abstract that out so that we can understand how many techniques exist for everyone. And so you start seeing that curve fly up at 50. So that's why we flattened it out, just so you can see. But you'll see there's a lot of that dark salmon color in this case, which implies that there's 50 plus technique or 50 plus procedures for that given technique. There's a lot of variance to a lot of these different techniques that exist. But to ATT&CK's own point, they're not trying to enumerate all the procedures, right? And so what you end up with is that when you're looking at this attack matrix, there's a lot of different ways that any one of these techniques could execute this technique variance, procedural variance, however you want to call it. That comes to the point that Bryson led off the introduction with me with, which is like from a BAS vendor perspective, how many procedures are they actually running, right? Maybe they're running multiple, maybe it's much more limited in what procedures it's doing, and it's really all executing it the same way. Or they're just changing an IP address or changing a file name, and they're considering that a second procedure. Not really the point. But the point here is that, right, there's too many procedures to be able to fully recognize, like just to color it in green and say you're done. So one of the things that I like to do is when I think about procedures, I want to think about what is the underlying data that's driving those procedures. How can we abstract procedures? Because tackling in some of those cases upwards of 100 different procedures, I mean, it's going to be whack-a-mole. At the end of the day, you're going to end up with the same problem that CVEs had way back when, in terms of just the volume is getting out of hand, and you can't figure out how to abstract that, right? And that was the beauty of ATT&CK. That's why ATT&CK resonated. So how can we figure out from all those procedures how much detection variation do we need in one way of looking at it? And so this is now a similar chart, although now we're using a different color scale. Well, I'm matching today apparently with my shirt, but you'll see that this is the number of data components that ATT&CK has that reference any given technique. And so this one, the max is 14. Not many go that far up. Many of them are much more in that 5 to 10 range, but you still see that there's a lot of different variation that could potentially exist from a detection capacity perspective, right? You need to collect a lot of different data to be able to address all the different procedures. So again, very hard problem. This one I like because this is looking at just Sigma rules as of April 7th. And what you'll see is that they also have this nasty tail in terms of some of these techniques have a huge number of analytics, things like PowerShell, for instance, where there's just so much variation. A lot of the initial acts, or a lot of the execution techniques in general are that way. But you see that to be able to appropriately detect, to color in a cell green, even just from like a Sigma world perspective. And that's not to say that a Sigma rule addresses every procedure. You're talking about having to have 5+ detections on so many of these different techniques and sub-techniques. So figuring out how to color in that cell is really hard. The adversaries are doing a lot of different things. They utilize a lot of different mechanisms to do it with the data components. And there's a lot of different ways that you could potentially detect it from the detection engineering side. And like that's multiple people, full-time jobs to be able to address all those things over time. And right, the landscape is continually adjusting. So how do you represent that in the matrix? But even beyond just detections, there's also the protections that we need to concern about, mitigations, responses, control frameworks, policies, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just about detections. There's so much different defensive capabilities that could exist within any one of these given cells that you need to be able to represent. All right. So one of the things that I wanted to point out here was how many matrices do people think actually exist in attack evaluations? Attack evaluations gets a lot of heat. I'm not with them anymore, so I won't take offense to heat given. But how many matrices actually exist? And it really only comes down to they only put scope matrices in. So that I thought that was a really interesting thing, right? Like you think of stoplight charts and coverage maps as kind of core to attack and to therefore attack evals, but they only use it for scope. That was for very intentional purposes, some of which I'll go in the Wayback Machine to kind of articulate here. So back when we created attack evals, one of the things we did not want it to be is the checklist. So we made the very purposeful plan to not do it as a matrix. Instead, what we did was just say, here's all the results. Here's all the techniques we ran. That wasn't really usable, right? At the end of the day, people wanted to understand, well, how does this thing cover this technique? And just doing a gigantic data file of here's the entire emulation plan and here's the detections that existed proved to not be that particularly helpful, at least for the layperson. And so what we then decided to do is, well, we still don't want to do the matrix. So maybe what we should do is this kind of like macOS Finder inspired kind of visualization to try to talk to it. So this is where it went instead, was to be able to show the results. So what we started with was, yeah, we definitely don't want to do matrix, to list, to inspire, the Finder inspired layout you saw here. There's also some graphs to show like the hits and the misses. But we took the approach that, you know what, because everybody's misusing the matrix, we're just going to not do the matrix. That can have some challenges because, again, people want the matrix, and that's oftentimes a complaint we heard. But there's some other challenges to that and the reasons why we made this. And so one of the things that we had was, right, like we started off with behaviors and enrichments, trying to say, okay, well, behavioral detections are going to be better than just like a simple rule focusing on the specific procedural level details and maybe like a super tailored net command, for instance. So what we tried to do was separate behaviors versus enrichments. That proved to be a challenge and hard. So then what we did was say, well, we're going to just include all the things, right? We're going to call them and just layer them based on how much context they're providing in terms of technique versus tactic. And then what we did was, well, people started misusing that. So instead it ended up being, oh, we'll just give credit for the top of that detection pyramid, the most specific, and we'll still show underlying data, but we'll only give you credit for one. So that way you can't count that you've got 10 detections on this one technique, and therefore you've got quote unquote coverage. And so what it ended up being is it's always this cat and mouse game to be able to try to head users off at misusing data, overgeneralizing, and trying to make too much or not enough sense from it, not looking at the context. There's a lot of rich context. So attack evals took this, the stoplight chart problem, and instead try to shift it to, we'll present it in a different way. And there's some value to that. And now it's their decision and they can take it wherever they want. But that's kind of where they came from, or where I came from back in the day when I made those decisions I did. But again, people want the matrix, right? People are familiar with the matrix. It's a great visualization. It's been a great visualization since the first time it landed in that Excel spreadsheet and Blake had to communicate our red team exercises results up to leadership. There's a reason why then every organization started doing the same thing. And it's because it makes sense. It is an easy to use visual. But at every step of the way, we have to take into consideration, how is the data going to be used? How's it going to be potentially misused? So this is a screenshot of the Tidal cyber platform. It's just an example sake for what it's worth in our enterprise edition. One of the things that we take into consideration is this a risk or is this confidence? Going back to one of the earlier slides I had, there was this little picture of the FAIR methodology. Lots of organizations love talking about risk. Risks have low numbers, confidence has high numbers. One of the things I like talking about confidence in is that it's not a 100% confident or 0% confident kind of thing. It's this gradient, right? You've got this continually evolved. You're getting more and more confident with the results, or less and less in some cases, but you've got this confidence that's constructed around it. So that's kind of how we approach it. But risk also could apply here, where you're instead looking at what is your risk or your residual risk that exists from the threat dimensions, if you will. So take some consideration, especially when you think about your audience, about who's going to be receiving your MITRE heat map or your attack heat map. How are they going to represent? How do they think? And I think that's an important first step. One of the other hot debates is always this green color. Green is one of those things people definitely want or people definitely hate. There's not a whole lot of middle ground when you talk about green. And I'd say also with red, we hear a lot of customers that want it. And as you see, we've got that ability. But one of the other things to consider is that green also implies a certain amount of doneness. And we don't want to have people ever thinking that they're purely done, right? Things continually evolve. So how to represent that? But something definitely for consideration when you're delivering your results. One of the other things to think through is like, what is, if you're going to associate a number especially, what is that magic number for saying that you're good? One of the things that we found early on with our findings, which is kind of predictable, I guess, looking in hindsight, was 100 is a bad idea. People always jump to 100 as being 100%, especially when we lump it in with the word confidence, 100% confident. 100 is, again, right, with people in the know, the Chris Peacocks of the world, the Brysons of the world, right? 100 is one of those things that's not attainable, right? And so we don't want to give that false representation. And so we actually chose to do a number based on 50, where it's, yeah, you can still get to 50, but there's some reasons there that I won't necessarily go to for this, but that's kind of how we approached it, just because 100 was one of those things that it's, again, just like green, it's a very debated place. So it's definitely something you want to consider as you present results. And then the other one is rate, like that stoplight chart view, versus maybe gradients and things like that. Again, there's pluses and minuses to all that. It all comes down to what's going to resonate with your users. But the point here is that, like, for even a simple thing like a coverage map, there's so many different decisions that you have to make that people are going to immediately use or misuse. I found so much of my time, especially in attack evals, was always trying to stay one step ahead of the misuses versus just developing the good product. It was oftentimes trying to figure out, okay, how's somebody going to misuse this data that we're doing? How's somebody going to misuse the representation? And but that's a terrible mindset to be in, because instead what we need to be doing is the more proactive thing about saying, okay, well, what questions are they want to answer? How can we present that in a way that's actually going to give them the amount of detail that they need to be able to do it? So to that degree, I think that this is a really important dimension that would be hidden underneath any one of those cells, and something that we need to be transparent about with our customers as a community, not just Tidal. But when we think about this, there's a couple different things that we need to recognize. Not all techniques are created equal is a core thing that we've always said back when I was at attack evals, something I still say today. It's actually really, I found it really interesting that Chris was going into discovery techniques when he was showing the example about like procedural variants. From that standpoint, like, we usually consider discovery techniques to be not hugely important, but what you could see there is if you can do it right, they could actually provide you a lot of value, because again, they're things that haven't changed a whole lot through time, because largely there's noise. So people are like, all right, hard problem, we're going to ignore discovery. But they're things that have to be done every time. And it's offers up really good consistent procedures to be tackling. And so I really like that Chris was kind of expanding the thought there around discovery versus kind of like the knee jerk. Everybody likes to try to point fingers at it. But to that point, you have to recognize that techniques vary, right? So there's the prevalence. This is something that we use a lot when we talk about our threat scores, is understanding that certain threats are more important than other threats to an organization. There's some that are broadly applicable, especially a lot of the ransomware groups or software, but there's also specific actors that organizations do care about. Maybe they know that they've historically targeted them and they want to be able to protect against them, right? That's the who's using it. And then there's also the dimension, though, that is the technique itself, right? So is that technique more important? Is that defensible, right? The actionability part of this CTID methodology for defining significant techniques, which frankly we don't leverage completely, but I think that there's a lot of good value in this, and the fact that you're thinking about from a threat perspective, what's the variance? How many different types of ways could they be executing it? If it's a high variance, maybe that means it should be worth a little bit less, because you're less confident that the technique actually is going to be implemented by your test or by your defense exactly how the adversary uses it. So think about that in terms of how much variance there exists. Again, who's using it, how many of the actors use it. Is it something that every actor is using, right? And then if so, it's probably something that's more important. So really try to understand the technique, understand which ones are more significant, understand their defensibility. One of the things that we like to do is not overly penalize organizations because they don't have a lot of those pre-attack, as it used to be called, like reconnaissance techniques covered. There's not a whole lot of enterprise detection opportunity there. And so what we try to do is not overly penalize the organization when we show them, here's your coverage map, and we don't just want to light it up red just because they don't have anything, right? So that's an example. We also try to recognize that different techniques are going to matter for different types of defenses. So layers of defense is really important. This was a Tim Malcolm-Better post from way ago, but it still applies, right? Most organizations don't just have EDR and call it good. They have their EDR, they've got their PAM, they've got their SIM, they've got their SOAR, they've got their NDR, they've got their firewall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that's building up this layered defense that you have to be able to represent. And going back to the threat, for things like credential dumping, protections matter more. For things like discovery, logging and detect probably is sufficient. So you have to understand for any given technique, any different tactic, how defenses relate, and not just use the blunt instrument of let's treat everything the same, let's throw it in the MITRE matrix, let's just give it a color and call it good. 5 analytics on PowerShell does not equal 5 analytics on credential dumping, right? They're just very different techniques, and they shouldn't just be applied as like a flat number. So we really try to capture the depth. When we look at threats, we look at all the threats that are using it. We look at the importance of it. We look at the defensibility of it. When we look at defenses, we look about, well, how effective are any given ones? We count every single rule that comes in as being something that's adding to your confidence. All that's being pushed against that procedural variance element so that we can come up with some kind of actual representation of what this cell could actually be. So a couple of the key lessons learned that we've had going through this, and some of which that I've talked to here, and something we've also heard already is don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? I think a lot of people try to attack coverage graphs because people are misusing them, right? People are trying to color them all and treat them as a pure on bingo card. You either have it or you don't. It's about how much depth there is, right? It's about understanding all the different protections that are in place, and is that enough for you? The stoplight chart at the end of the day should be this mechanism to abstract things so you can appropriately prioritize. You can get the high level view of where you're at, but you can also understand, here's where there are gaps. Here are where there are things that I need to address to improve. Being able to understand when we go back to like this chart, I know it's small in the background, but to be able to stand for the green. Okay, green I'm probably quote unquote good with, at least compared to the other things. Yellow and oranges are the things that I need to work on, especially the oranges. And if there were reds here, those would be the places to focus your energy. But what you have to do is have that number represent, or have that color represent, both the importance of the threat and how that relates to the defensive capabilities that you've put into place and your confidence in those. One of the things I haven't mentioned here is efficacy of those defenses. The more you can measure it with things like breach and attack simulation tools, like atomic red teams, like red teams, right? All that pulls in data that should be hopefully improving your confidence that things actually work, or pulling down the number because things aren't working as you expect. So estimates good, empirical better, but definitely take into consider all that. But abstraction is important. We can't just be focusing on saying, go do all the procedures, because again, we don't want this to end up being just another battle with every CV that's out there, and trying to do the whack-a-mole that way. We have to be able to recognize that there's a beauty in being able to abstract. There's a beauty in being able to pull it into those matrices that lots of sophisticated organizations really do like. And even we're finding that's pushing down market, and even less sophisticated organizations, as long as they can understand what those numbers are, it helps give them an idea that, yeah, we are positioned to actually defend against the threat and the behaviors that they have. One of the things that also was brought up earlier was that whole like presumed breach mentality, right? Adversaries will get in. I think that's a really important to mention. And attack and the matrix help really understand what are the implications if they do get in, right? There's they have that initial access type of tactic and some of the pre-attack ones, but at the end of the day, the meat and potatoes of it, if you will, comes down to all that post-breach activity that could be defensive opportunity before you get to that end, that impact, that either exfiltration or stealing of information, encrypting and wiping, and all those nasty things that could happen as the end result. Instead, it's about trying to figure out how do we layer in our defenses across the matrix, give it depth so that we can improve. So key considerations, really things that I wanted to give the audience is, I've lived a lot of experience about the goods and the bads of how to present information, how it gets misused, and how it can be used beneficially. When you build out your attack matrix that you give as the deliverable at the end of your engagement, or for a vendor who delivers it as part of their product, right? I think it's really important to take into consideration how are they going to react, or in many cases overreact to a color or to a score, right? Is it something that is going to give off the wrong impression, and not the impression that you believe you should be able to give, right? Being able to say, instead of, okay, here's the green, maybe you want to choose a different color. And maybe you, more importantly, want to be able to have that click in so that they can then get the details to say, okay, these were the 5 procedures that were tested, and this is the results of those, or this is the 1 procedure, this is how it was done. So definitely take into consideration both the coloration as well as the amount of detail you're providing, so that people don't think that just because it was tested, just because it passed, they're done, they're good. And that doesn't even get into the time dimensions of it, which I won't go down that rabbit hole. One of the other things to consider is this metric minded versus high level visuals. So again, for a lot of the sophisticated folks that are more risk centric, especially from my perspective, they are more metric minded. They like to see a score. Scores I'm not a huge fan of, but at the end of the day, there's some value to them. And if you can see beyond the number and get the big purpose behind the number, they're okay. What I think resonates a lot with especially the not quite risk-minded folk is the high-level visuals. So do gradients instead. Gradients can still tell you a lot. You saw that I was using gradients for some of the analysis I was doing on the procedures and detections and data components, etc. But take that into consideration. And then the other aspect I touched on in the first bullet, but really, how do you represent the depth? How do you represent the depth both from the threat side in terms of the number of procedures or the number of tests that were run, as well as from the defense side, the number of detections and protections and mitigations, the diversity that exists within there? Because again, we have to somehow get from this matrix, that's this 2D thing, and recognize that there is this depth. And again, that's a place where sometimes gradients can help. But bottom line is you're usually trying to pack a lot of information in, and it's a hard thing to do. And maybe it's not a one size fits all either. But if you think about who the audience is and what they're really trying to answer, I think that gets to a lot. I think through my history, I oftentimes thought about the ways that technically what I wanted the data to represent. That can sometimes make it a very pure representation of the results. But what you lose is a lot of the usability because you're not thinking about the end user and what they're actually trying to get from it. What's that manager trying to look at? Like when Blake was giving out that initial spreadsheet up through the MITRE management chain to show where our progress was, right? They didn't need to know all the details about the number of ways that the red team executed it. What at the end of the day, they needed to know, are we good or are we not? And you know what? That's the answer. That's the level of detail they need to do. We need to be able to supply them with that, but we need to do it in a way that also doesn't compromise the whole thing. So I don't know. I'll get off my soapbox, but I just wanted to be able to kind of layer in a little bit of that kind of context as, again, somebody that's taken more punches than needs to be through my time with attack.
Frank, if there's anybody who's empathetic to the soapbox, it's me. You are welcome to it. Welcome to UniCon. We do soapboxes here because we think that you have value in doing it.
I appreciate that.
All right. So, first question. How would you balance the need for comprehensive analysis of the MITRE ATT&CK framework with the practical limitations of our security resources and budget while also meeting industry standards?
That's a lot of depth to that question.
Yeah, there is.
One, I think the first part is trying to understand where do you currently have your investments. So trying to understand how do your capabilities, how do your products, how do your controls map into the attack framework. I mean, vendors have a lot of it. It's unfortunately usually not really usable, frankly, because it ends up being something that is an overgeneralized marketing spiel. Self-plug, Tidal does try to work with vendors to get at a little bit lower level to understand what those mappings are. I would say go off and do your own mappings, except that's usually a highbrow thing to do and not always the easiest. That ransomware framework that we were seeing earlier, right? That could be another source for it. But the first part is understand this is what you have. From there, you then have to kind of understand these are the threats. These are the ones that are more important than other ones. If you can do that, then you can prioritize, right? You can understand, okay, for where I am in an organization, from who I am as an organization, I should say, for this sector, for this region, from everything that's coming into my, these are the techniques that I need to prioritize. That allows you then to say, okay, for these ones, based on the defenses that I have, these ones I'm doing okay with, these ones I'm not doing okay with. You're never going to be perfect with everything, but you can at least take this mindset of being able to prioritize where the priorities need to happen. So I think that that's really what it all comes down to, especially when we talk about threat-informed defense. It really comes down to being able to understand the threats, understand the ones that should matter most to you, and then understanding how you're positioned and what you can do about it. And there's a lot to unpack there, but if you take it from a small bite at a time, looking at the threats that are most important or the most practical, even if it's a single threat that just is your boogeyman that you're afraid of and keeps you up at night, right? That goes a long way to being able to address it. So that's kind of the general guidance we give to be able to kind of make it a more tractable problem.
What are some limitations or differences in current security controls, such as CIS, that may not be included by the MITRE ATT&CK framework? How do we leverage those differences?
So for one, there is some work that organizations do that do map like sys controls into the attack framework to try to provide it. I think that the one thing to really keep in mind that we work with customers to do is understand that controls are, again, something that a lot of organizations are using, so we can't ignore them, but they're like good in theory kind of thing. If everybody's actually implementing them the way that they are supposed to be implemented, and we don't have drift and things are actually configured, people are actually doing what they're told, they'll work. So you kind of have to understand that there's a certain amount of hand waviness to them. But you can leverage a lot of the work that CIS has done, or some of these other control frameworks have done. I know the Center for Threat-Informed Defense, which I won't mention too loudly here, they do some as well in terms of those mappings. So you can pull in and understand how those relate. I will say that attack isn't a replacement for good hygiene, or threat-informed defense isn't a replacement for good hygiene and preparation and doing all those good control works. But it's about understanding what is the depth of protection. If those things fail, this is how well you're positioned or not positioned. So hopefully that's a little bit of useful guidance. I mean, we have a hard time with some of the controls. Some of the other ones are easier and you can actually represent them. Attack mitigations map actually pretty well to a lot of those control frameworks. So I wouldn't underestimate the work that attack has already done on that front.
All right. Okay. Sorry, some people put some administrative questions in there. What are the top 3 things you would suggest operations admins do to secure an environment? For instance, 1, patch Windows 10 with Windows Update for Business. 2, use firewalls and isolate from the internet. And 3, use huge 15 to 20 character passphrases.
So unplug the computers, I think, is what I was taught was the most secure. No, I think it comes down to, again, diversity is where my high horse is. I think that being able to have a variety of capabilities in place. Right, if you don't have an EDR, attack's not really for you. You're not going to have really good coverage into it. You're going to still be really focused on initial access or maybe some of the network stuff. So it kind of comes down to sophistication, but yeah, that's really a cop-out answer, but there is no silver bullet. It's really about just stacking.
All right. Anything you'd like to leave folks with for final thoughts?
No, I think that again, attack's this complicated thing. I'm always available through a lot of different platforms. If anybody ever has questions and just wants to nerd out on it, I'm always happy to talk about it. Definitely check out app.titlecyber.com as our plug. It is a community platform that tries to pull in all the content from attack, enrich it. We've got a community spotlight where we have our director of CTI continually putting in new threats in, so things that might not be mapped to attack as of today. So things like Lockbit are part of that platform. So we're continuing to enrich. And we also have a lot of product information, Sigma analytics. Scythe is in there, Atomic Red Team's in there, so you can understand from a testing perspective how those match up. But there's a lot of functionality there. It's free. No logons required, though logons will get you things about being able to make notes or custom technique sets and a lot of good functionality. So let us know if we can help you. Let me know if I can help you. And good luck with your presentation with attack and not making it all green.
I didn't know you were so anti-environmental.
Or Kermit the Frog. So anti-Kermit.
Yeah, it is. It is. Frogs are like amphibians freak me out. So yeah, Kermit's no good. Yeah.
But not unicorns.
Yeah. No. Unicorns are great, especially chubby unicorns.
There you go.
Frank's reference there is swag.scythe.io. The charity that we support is for the conservation of chubby unicorns. An example, endangered rhinoceroses. So we have collaborated with a conservation fund for that, hence the chubby unicorn joke.